I am excited today to have a guest speaker with us. Well, he's not really a guest, he's a regular attender, but Nate Harris is one of our elders here. He's also our local police sergeant, and he happens to be one of my closest friends, and we were looking for an opportunity for Nate to share from the Word. He actually helped cover a gap we had a few months ago, but Proverbs 30 is one of his favorite chapters, and so I was excited today to have this opportunity for him to come up and to share from God's Word with us. Incidentally, next week, Annabelle and I will actually be team teaching on Proverbs 31, so that'll be fun as well. So if you would, please give a round of applause and welcome Nate Harris.
As for me, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. Thank you, guys. I'd have you out in record time if that was the entirety of my sermon. But that quote was actually Socrates, right? And the idea behind it, the crux of it is humility. It's like, we can only know a small piece of things. The world is full of knowledge, and we can only understand a finite amount of it. The themes that we're going to see in Proverbs 30 tie in with humility. And what you're going to see is the beginning of the chapter. It talks about Proverbs 30 being the sayings of Agur, son of Jacob. And if we take that name at face value, we don't know who Agur is. We don't know who Jacob is, or why being the son of Jacob would be important. Some people speculate that the word Agur is just another name for Solomon. And we know that Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's referred to as Koheleth, which means collector, a collector of sayings. So the word Agur has a similar meaning. So I'll make the argument to you guys, and I think there's a lot of people who share a similar vision that this was written by Solomon. But even if it wasn't, we know it's connected to Proverbs 30. We know that Solomon thought that the sayings found in this chapter were extremely important. And I'm going to make that argument to you today, that they are extremely important. Socrates lived approximately 500 years before Solomon, where we're going to see that they shared similar ideas. And you're going to see amongst wise men who recognize their place in the universe, they're going to have similar ideas about the necessity of humility in the pursuit of wisdom. Starting with verse 1, the sayings of Agur, son of Jacob, an inspired utterance, this man's utterance to Ithiel. I am weary, God, but I can prevail. Surely I am only a brute and not a man. I do not have human understanding. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I attained to the knowledge of Holy One. So this verse, I am weary, God, but I can prevail. My wife was helping me with getting my sermon ready. She felt that she identified with this verse because she has 2 kids and she's 31 weeks pregnant. And so we were tying it to another quote, which is, the horrors persist, but so do I, right? But I can prevail. Surely I am only a brute and not a man. I do not have human understanding. The author here is humbling himself, saying that he's weary, that this pursuit of wisdom and knowledge wears him out, and that he hardly has the understanding that he thinks a man should have. We obviously know that Solomon is one of the wisest men. God imbued him specifically with wisdom unlike any other. But he still has the humility to humble himself. Then we see in verse 3, I have not learned wisdom, nor have I attained to the knowledge of the Holy One. None of us can aspire to the knowledge of God. God is so far above us. He exists outside of time and space. And he, as we see in the next couple of verses, he set the earth on its foundations. We can't have the mind of God, but we do have his words. Verse 4 says, who has gone up to heaven and come down? Whose hands have gathered up the wind? Who has wrapped up the waters in a cloak? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is the name of his son? Surely you know. These couple of verses are interesting because we know, obviously, that they're attributable to God. We know that God is in heaven. We know that he has control over the course of events, over the wind and the waves, and that he set the foundations of the earth. He established all of the ends of it. But it's interesting, too, because we know in the same way that Jesus fulfilled many of these things, we see when Jesus is talking to the Pharisee Nicodemus, he says, only the Son of Man has ascended and come down. And some people think he's actually referring to this verse when he makes that proclamation. And then we also see that there's a story in the Gospels about Jesus being asleep on a boat with his disciples. And the disciples are afraid because there's this storm coming, and the wind and the waves are moving the boat about. And they go and they wake up Jesus, and they said, Jesus, wake up, help us, or we're going to die. And Jesus stands up, and he says to the winds and the waves, peace, be still. And the disciples remark, who is this that both the wind and the seas obey him? And then we also see throughout the Gospels, in Colossians specifically, we know that the Word was God, and the Word was with God in the beginning, that Jesus is God made flesh, come down, and that he pre-existed time in the same way as our conception of God. And so he helped set the foundations in the earth, and all of the foundations of the earth were set into place for God, for Jesus. And so these couple of verses, we know that they're attributed to God, and we know in this last part, it says, what is his name and what is the name of his son? And so I'd make the argument to you guys that Proverbs 30 is a mixture of poetry, it's a mixture of mystery, but also of prophecy. But we know the point of what the author is saying, because he'd have no, obviously, intonation about the coming of Jesus, is that there's no man that is like this. There's no man that is like God. There's no man that is like Jesus. Verse 5 goes on to say, every word of God is flawless. He's a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, or he will rebuke you and prove you a liar. The word flawless in the Hebrew can also mean well-tested. What we know about the words of God is that they're reliable. That if you follow the words of God to the letter, you will have a good life. Wisdom is a shield that can protect us. And if we take refuge in it, we'll be in a place of security. But verse 6 adds this injunction. It says, do not add to his words, or he will rebuke you and prove you a liar. In the Ten Commandments, we see the third commandment is do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And many people attribute that to mean that you should not use God's name as a swear word. And I think that's good practice, and I think you can take that interpretation from it. But I think what it also means is that you should not bend and twist or add to the words of God as a way to vain conceit or selfish ambition. And that if you do this, if you think that your words are so great, excuse me, you think that your words are so great that they can live up to God's words, that they can take the place of God's words, then you lack humility. And ultimately, you're going to be proven a liar. But you cannot bend and twist the words of God to change the nature of reality. Only God sets the earth and everything into motion. Verse 7 says, 2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I might have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God. We see in the Lord's Prayer, the beginning of the Lord's Prayer is kind of a proclamation of humility. It says, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And then it says, give us this day our daily bread. So the first part of that prayer, excuse me, is a recognition that God is above us, that his domain is in heaven, that he exists outside of our conception of time, and that when we're coming before God, we should take a posture of humility, recognizing that it's his will that should be done before anything that we could ask for. And then it's interesting because a lot of us have this idea that when we go before God, that he's our magic genie, he's our wish factory. That, Lord, I want a Ferrari. Lord, make me rich. Lord, do this for me. Do this thing I want for me. And that God will just grant it. But Jesus teaches us to pray. He says, give us this day our daily bread. And Solomon is saying the same thing. But give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Because there's a danger to poverty in the same way there's a danger to riches. And the danger of riches is the danger of self-reliance. Because I know I have this problem. But when things are going well for me, do I pray? Do I ask for God's help? Do I wake up every morning when I'm not suffering, when I'm not afflicted, when something isn't going terribly wrong? Do I seek God in the way that I should? And I'd venture to guess that most of us don't. Because most of us, when we're healthy, when we have all of our needs provided for us, when we're distracted by the pleasures and the excess that the world can provide us, we don't feel that we need to have the reliance on God that we should. We become arrogant. We lose our humility. And then they're saying, it's at verse 9, it's saying, give me neither poverty, or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God. There's also a danger to poverty. Solomon is saying, Lord, I don't want to be in such a position of destitution that I feel that I need to go out and steal to provide for my basic needs. Because if I were to do that, if I were to live that kind of lifestyle, I know I would dishonor you and not be able to live up to your words and your wisdom. So speaking to moderation is speaking to having what we need, but having a reliance on God. And you're going to see themes of moderation throughout the rest of this chapter. In verse 10, it says, do not slander a servant to their master, or they will curse you, and you will pay for it. Obviously, in our society now, we don't have a servant-master relationship, but all of us are work for someone or accountable to someone, or we will routinely interact with coworkers or people in a position to serve us. So, for example, when we go to a restaurant and we have a waiter or a waitress that maybe isn't giving us the level of service that we feel that we are deserving of, it's very easy to slander them. It's very easy to make a complaint to the manager. We can take things personally, and we can twist that to see people as instruments to get what we want. And so there's a danger to that because we don't know what is going on in the lives of the people around us very many times. And somebody could be having the worst day of their life. They could have gotten 3 hours of sleep. They could have a baby at home, be a single mother or father, and wake up extremely tired and forgetful. And maybe they're not doing the best at their job. But as anyone can tell you, and as I can tell you, you're going to have bad days at work. And if you judge everyone according to that bad day, if you were judged according to that bad day, and your livelihood was put at stake because of that bad day that you had, that would be a standard that none of us could live up to. So it's important not to take what somebody does to us personally and see their lack of what we think is the service that we should have as a way to be overly critical or harsh or even lie and slander them. And it says, or they will curse you and you will pay for it. God doesn't like it either. And so when God hears their cries in frustration and out against the way that you treated them, God will hear it and hold you accountable. Verse 11 says, there are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. Those who are pure in their own eyes and yet are not cleansed of their filth. Those whose eyes are ever so haughty, whose glances are so disdainful. Those whose teeth are swords and whose jaws are set with knives, to devour the poor from the earth and the needy from among mankind. There's a theme throughout the Bible, and it's encapsulated in the fifth commandment. And it says, honor your father and your mother, so that you may have a long life. And in Proverbs 30, we're going to see a couple of different the necessity of honoring our parents. It's very easy for us to forsake the authorities and the people that God has put in our lives to help us and to go on and do our own way and seem righteous in our own eyes. Not all of us have had the blessing of good parents who taught us wisdom and taught us the right way to go, who brought us up in the church. But many of us do. And even those of us who don't inherently know that the way that our parents may have behaved is not the godly way that we should go. And so, in the same way, I tell my wife, honey, I'm not completely useless. I can be used as a bad example. Some of our parents are the bad examples that set us on the right path because they show us what not to do. But this is speaking in part to those of us who have good parents. And there's such an importance about having a respect for those authority figures, for honoring them. Many of us as parents will see that in the ways that we dishonored our parents will be manifested in our children because they are mere reflections of us. So it's so important to have this recognition for authority, because later on in the chapter, we're going to see it brought out in graphic detail what can happen to us if we don't. But verse 12 says, there are those who are pure in their own eyes, yet are not cleansed of their filth. I instantly think of the verse in the Gospels. It says, before you judge the speck in your brother's eye, you need to take the plank out of your own. The word filth here in Hebrew is literally dung or feces. And in the same way, we can have this huge plank in our own eyes. We can still clearly see the sins of others. And we lack the humility when we do that. We're arrogant when we do that. And we're not recognizing the filth that covers us. And some of the most judgmental people that you'll ever meet are some of the people who are covered in the most filth. And there's a hypocrisy to that. Verse 13 says, those whose eyes are ever so haughty, whose glances are so disdainful, those whose teeth are swords and those whose jaws are set with knives to devour the poor from the earth and the needy from men. When you think that you're better than people, when you don't treat people as God sees them, that they are divine creatures created in his image, you can fall down this trap. And the trap is that you see people in two categories. You see people as tools or obstacles. And the problem with seeing people as tools or obstacles is if there are tools, you use them instrumentally for your own benefit. And if you see them as obstacles, what do we do with obstacles? We remove them or destroy them. And so this is speaking to that. And one of the easiest times that you can see this, and I deal with it in law enforcement too. All of you dealt with it in traffic. So when someone's speeding and someone cuts you off, or if you're a police officer and you're responding to that code call, you feel super important because you're the guy who's going to go out there to help, and you've got lights and sirens on, and nobody's moving out of your way. It's very easy to take that personally because I'm the police. I'm here to help. Get out of my way, right? And thankfully, my body cam is probably not running, because if it was and you were to hear some of the things that I whisper or yell, you probably wouldn't want me up here. But all of us do that. We see people as obstacles. We see them speeding and cutting us off, and we take that personally. Very easy to do that. They're an obstacle. I'm trying to get to where I need to go. They should recognize that. It's a recognition that you're better. And it plays into your ego, because the person who sees my lights and sirens, they're not intentionally staying in front of me in the slow lane going 35 and a 55, right? They may just not be paying attention. And I can take that personally. So all of us can. The person who cuts you off may be running to an emergency themselves. We don't know. But it says, those whose jaws are set with knives to devour the poor from the earth and the needy from mankind. The easiest people to remove as obstacles are those who are most vulnerable. And so we have a danger of that. When we think that we're better than others, we forget those who need our help the most. and we victimize them in the worst ways. Verse 15 says, "The leech has 2 daughters. Give, give," they cry. That verse describing a leech has 2 suckers on it. One of the suckers is for feeding, and one of the suckers helps it move across a body. And what it's saying is that a leech is never satisfied with blood. It always wants more. And these next things are 3 things that are never satisfied. It says, 4 that never say enough: the grave, the barren womb, land which is never satisfied with water, and fire which never says enough. All of us know that none of us get out of here alive. The grave is going to eventually swallow all of us up. Benjamin Franklin said that the only certainty is death and taxes. And I believe that. But the next one, the barren womb, only a woman who wants to become a mother but can't understands the unfulfilled longing and desire to have children but be incapable. We see that in the Bible, throughout the Bible. Rachel is married to Jacob, and Jacob also has another wife named Leah. Leah is able to provide him with all the children, and Rachel is barren. And Rachel cries out to Jacob, "Give me children or I will die." That unfulfilled longing and desire can set her on a path of depression, set her on a path of desperation that can consume her. The next one says, land which is never satisfied with water. This is an unquenchable thirst. If you were to ask a severe alcoholic, when will you have drinking enough alcohol? What would their answer be? Never. It's an unquenchable thirst. In the same way, we see a quote from John Rockefeller, who's one of the richest men of his time. And Rockefeller was asked, how much money is enough? And his response is, just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. And it says fire, which never says enough. We have these passions, these desires, sometimes these anger that will burn up and consume everything in our pursuit for our own selfish ambition or gain. And so what this is saying is that you need to live in a place of moderation, because all of us in our lives have a God-shaped hole. And if you think that you can fulfill it with the things that are on this earth, you're wrong. Only God can fulfill that hole in our lives. So we should have the humility to understand that the things that we want, our desires, should be for God. Because if they're not, they'll lead us astray and consume and destroy us. Verse 17 says, the eye that mocks a father, that scorns an aged mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley and will be eaten by the vultures. So 17 is connected to verse 11, talking about there are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. And it's going to talk about what the inevitable consequence of a person who lives a life where they don't honor their parents or they have disrespect for the authority figures in their life. Many of us know people, and I can tell you 100 stories of people that I've met throughout my life who have a disdain for authority. You see it in policing all the time. And this is giving very graphic language that the eye that mocks the father, that scorns the mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley, will be eaten by the vultures. Ravens and vultures are known as carrion, which are scavengers. And scavengers eat the dead flesh of the recently dead. And so what this is saying is that if you live in such a way, such a prideful way, where you disregard the wisdom of your parents, where you disregard the authority figures, that what you're liable to be is to wander in exile outside of your community like a disease-wounded animal until you perish and your body is left to be devoured by the scavengers. And it's difficult for us to comprehend that because we live in a society right now where I go to death investigations all the time, and it doesn't matter who it is, but when someone dies, the police show up, we investigate, we call the medical examiner, the coroner, and then we call the mortuary service so that we can give that body the proper reverence that it deserves, so that people aren't left to die on the streets in front of everyone. But this is saying that a person who lives like that, who lives recklessly, that there's someone who is going to be exiled, who's going to die in the worst ways and under the worst circumstances. And if you have any doubt that that can happen, go have a one-on-one conversation with anyone in the medical field or anyone in policing, and we can tell you some of the ways where your life path will lead you to that inevitable outcome. Verse 18 says, "There are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 that I do not understand: the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a young woman." One of the things you'll see about the way that these are written, so we're into a kind of a different section of Proverbs 30. So this is kind of the poetry, and some of these are riddles. We're meant to look at the 3 things and compare them to the 4th. So there's heavy emphasis on the fourth, and it's drawing parallelism. And in Hebrew wisdom sayings, this parallelism is an important part of it. But also we're talking about different things. We're talking about an eagle in the sky. We're talking about a snake on a rock. And it's interesting too, because we're talking about if this is written by Solomon. And we see in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 33, it says, "He spoke about plant life, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. From all the nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by the kings of the world who had heard his wisdom." So we see here that this is the way that Solomon spoke. He spoke about nature. He would observe God's creation, and he would draw wisdom from what he saw in creation. So that's an important thing to take from this. And the other part of this is, a lot of the way that this is written, this pattern of 3 and then a 4th, we also see in Proverbs chapter 6. So the author is saying that there are 3 things that are too amazing for him, and 4 that he does not understand: the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a young woman. So these first 3, obviously it is amazing that the way an eagle flies. And it took humanity a long time to figure out flight, because it is not an easy thing to conceptualize. But an eagle in the sky does not leave a path or a trace. In the same way that if you've seen a snake move on a rock, it's kind of mesmerizing the way that they move. But they also, when they're walking along the rocks, they don't leave a path or a trace behind them. They're not like a snail. And then this other one we see is about a ship on the high seas. And it's amazing that a ship can weigh and be so big and large and still be buoyant. And we know that even though a ship can leave a wake in its path, that wake dissipates and it leaves no trace. So this last part, and the way of a man with a young woman, obviously the first three things, the speaker is speaking humbly. These things are too amazing for me. I don't understand them. But we see that this last part is connected to verse 20, which comes next, which says, "This is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, 'I've done nothing wrong.'" So that injunction about doing nothing wrong is a harken back to verse 12, which says, "Those who are pure in their own eyes and yet are not cleansed of their filth." The prostitute or the adulterous woman, and it could be an adulterous man as well, someone who has a voracious sexual appetite, who does things carelessly and is never satisfied. And a person, in the same way that a person who eats voraciously, the evidence of that will be smeared across their face. This adulterous woman is like that. And in the same way that a criminal, a killer, tosses away the murder weapon to get rid of the evidence, she has to wipe her mouth to get rid of the evidence. And even though she's covered in the filth of her sin, she says in her pride, "I've done nothing wrong." And so what it's talking about here is that there is a pure and undefiled, a way that leaves no trace in regards to sexual relations between a man and a woman. And that obviously is supposed to happen in marriage. There are scars left behind when you use people instrumentally as a hedonistic object in pursuit of your own pleasure. Because in the same way that you're using them, you're also using yourself that way, and you're covering yourself in sin. And so a relationship that is pure and undefilable, it leaves no scar spiritually, physically, or emotionally. In verse 21, it says, "Under 3 things the earth trembles. Under 4 it cannot bear up. A servant who becomes king, a godless fool who gets plenty to eat, a contemptible woman who gets married, and a servant who displaces her mistress." That first one, a servant who becomes king, reminds me of a story. It's called The Sword of Damocles. And the idea behind it is that a servant goes to the king and he says, how great it would be to be king. I would have every pleasure that I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted and have no worries. And so the king lets the servant be king for a day. But what the servant instantly realizes as he walks about is that there is a sword above his head hanging from a string. And the king tells him that that sword can fall at any time. Because the weight of the crown, the weight of kingship carries responsibility and it carries danger. And at any time, a king can have an invading force come in, or a king could have his subjects revolt and depose and execute him. So there's a danger to a servant who becomes a king because that hedonism, that pursuit of impulsive pleasure instantly becomes available to him. But then he also does not understand the difficulties of leadership and the dangers associated with that. The next is a godless fool who gets plenty to eat. I'm continually reminded of 2 Thessalonians 3:10, which says, "He who does not work shall not eat." We disrupt God's cosmic order when we enable people in their foolishness. And someone who is acting foolishly, someone who is unwilling to work, someone who's unwilling to live by the rules, for them to be satiated in their body, for them to not feel the consequences of those poor decisions, enables them to continue in their foolishness. Because at least a fool with a hungry belly will recognize, I'm doing something wrong because I'm hungry and other people don't seem as hungry as me. And that should cause some self-reflection. And a lot of what we're talking about here in this part of the chapter is having that self-reflection. In 23, it says, a contemptible woman who gets married. Contemptible can mean hated. It can mean unloved. But a person, whether male or female, who thinks that a marriage or a relationship is going to solve them, is going to fix their problems, you're in for a treat. Because marriage can help you be a better person. But if you don't go into that marriage with the humility before God, knowing that it's not about you, but about the relationship and about how you can serve God with it and about how you can care for your kids and raise them. If you don't subordinate yourself to that, your marriage is going to end. Or it will continue and you will wish it did. And the last part says, a servant who displaces her mistress. And the easiest way to conceptualize this is the nanny who has an affair with the husband and displaces the wife. And obviously this can be back or forth. You know, if you had a female, you were a female and you had a male coworker and you cheated on the male coworker against your husband and displaced him. The problem with this is that a person, whether the nanny or someone else, who does not realize that they're breaking up a home, who does not have the self-awareness to realize that they're doing that, a person who is willing to cheat with you is willing to cheat on you. And you should have some humility in understanding that, and understanding that that is would not be the proper godly way to start off a relationship. Verse 24 says, 4 things on earth are small, yet they are extremely wise. Ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. So we're talking about very humble animals, and these insects, these animals that we're going to be talking about, in themselves, they're small and defenseless and weak. But one of the things that Amy can bring up here is it's a picture of an anthill. And many of us can see ants moving around all the time, but it's very difficult to see, obviously, what they have going on under the ground. But it's saying ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. You know, these different chambers of an ant colony would be used for different things. In one of the chambers, they may have their queen, who is creating more ants, but they would also have areas where they store up food. And if any of you guys have been through Financial Peace University or have any sort of wisdom, we know that in the good times when we're able to work, if we're prudent, we should store up money, resources for the difficult times. The ants store up their food in the winter or in the summer so that they'll have food in the winter. And in verse 26, we see hyraxes are creatures of little power, yet they make their home in the crags. Many of you don't probably know what a hyrax is, but it's a rock badger. And it's that cute little guy in the middle. This is my spirit animal. That's how I feel on the inside. But you just want to cuddle him. Are any of you guys afraid of the rock badger? I haven't seen his teeth, but I can tell you they probably look like a rabbit's. But you can see on the right here, there's a community of rock badgers. They're in a community together, and they make their home amongst the rocks in the mountainous areas. And the reason why they do that is because there are birds of prey, there are foxes and other predatory animals, that if they see this cute little defenseless rock badger, they think of an easy meal. And so what the rock badgers will do is they'll gang together, and when these predators come, they will hide themselves amongst the rocks as a form of protection. And we can see this theme of the solid rock throughout the entirety of the Bible. And one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite songs is, "On Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." And that comes from a verse in Matthew where it talks about building your house on a firm foundation and not on the sand, but on the rocks. And so there's safety and security both together, but both in taking your protection in something that is solid. That's that shield of wisdom that we spoke about earlier. Verse 27 says, "Locusts have no king, yet they advance together in ranks." Locusts have no formal rank structure. I don't see any chief stars or sergeant stripes on any of those guys, right? They don't know who to follow. But if you've seen videos or pictures of the huge swarms of billions of locusts swarming, they can cause billions and billions of dollars in ecological damage to an area. And they can do it very, very quickly, just completely decimate the vegetation. And they all move together, seemingly like they're following a leader that's directing them to where they should go. And what we can take from this is that in the same way that all of nature finds itself in a community of people working together towards a similar goal, we as believers should have the humility to understand that we can't do things on our own. And imagine if we were like the locusts, but for a good purpose. If we decided as a community of believers that we were going to set our minds to do the Lord's will and then work together to accomplish that, who could stand in front of us? Who could stop us? Verse 28 says, "A lizard can be caught with the hand, yet it is found in king's palaces." A small child can grab a lizard and can hold it in their hand. But we can see that lizards are fast, they're cunning, they can scale vertical walls, they can squeeze themselves into cracks. And even though they're small and vulnerable, they can find them through their cunning, through their guile, they can find themselves in the highest circles of society, in king's palaces. saying that even someone from humble beginnings, if they use wisdom, if they use the abilities that God has given them, that they can be brought to a high place. Verse 29 says, there are 3 things that are stately in their stride, 4 that move with stately bearing, a lion, mighty among beasts, who retreats before nothing, a strutting rooster, and a he-goat. A lion finds its power in its strength. He's the king of the jungle. He's not afraid of anything. Those are traits that are innate to its nature. And in the same way those traits are innate to its nature, a strutting rooster and a he-goat have a confidence and a pride that is innate to them. Right? A strutting rooster will strut around and think it's the baddest thing on the planet. And they can be kind of mean. And they'll yell at it all hours of the morning because they have not a care in the world other than themselves. And he-goats can be similar to that. But it's saying, and it's comparing a king, it's saying a strutting rooster, a he-goat, and a king secure against revolt. So what does that have to do with kings? What it's saying here is that a king is only as secure in his position as he has the consent of the people that he governs. And we can see that throughout history. People will rise up when they have a tyrannical king and they'll depose him. That's the story of American history. It's a story of history throughout time. So a king's strength comes from his security and knowing that his people support him. So that's an important part for people in leadership, for people in authority, that they operate under the will and the consent of the people that they govern. And we see this in policing because we have 6 officers in Myrtle Point. And I can tell you, if we have 6 people running around the community causing mayhem, we have our hands full. If we have 600, we have no chance. We operate under the consent of the governed. Government should fear their people. People should not fear their governments. Verse 32 says, if you play the fool and exalt yourself, or if you plan evil, clap your hand over your mouth. For as churning cream produces butter, and as twisting the nose produces blood, so stirring up anger produces strife. So these last verses, talking about the inevitability of the consequences of your pride. If you choose to exalt yourself, if you choose to think that you're better than others, if you treat people instrumentally, if you treat them as obstacles, there will be consequences of that. One of the things you'll hear Lloyd say, and it's a very common saying in policing, but if you play stupid games, you will win stupid prizes. And it's saying that in the same way that you would churn cream to produce butter, it compares that to twisting the nose produces blood. If you stir up anger, you slander your friends, you're going to get punched in the nose, and it's going to bleed like every other nose. And in the same way, so stirring up anger produces strife. The word strife here can also mean legal dispute, can mean lawsuit. And so that's an interesting thing to think about because from the policing standpoint, one of the things I try to teach my officers is to have an awareness of their ego. There's a concept called contempt of cop, and it's where a police officer will either act outside of his authority or maybe even inside of his authority, but he'll weaponize the law to get back at somebody he feels has made him upset or has said something he didn't like and hurt his ego. There's a video that's going around right now of an officer who was investigating a car crash, and the gentleman, his elderly gentleman that he's speaking to, is yelling and is upset. And we don't know if he has some cognitive problems, but he's nearly 80 years old. And he is yelling at the officer, and he winds up tapping him in the chest, just like that. And this is, mind you, a nearly 80-year-old man. You shouldn't put your hands on the police. But what does the officer do? Does he take a step back? He says, hey. Does he say, hey, don't touch me? Hey, you're going to be arrested if you put your hands on me. Does he do that? No. No, what he does is he grabs the old man, he twists him up like a pretzel, and he throws him face down on the ground. And he spends a couple weeks in the hospital. There's a phrase in policing called lawful but awful. If you put your hands on the police, you can probably presume that you're going to be arrested for that, right? It would probably be within the officer's authority to legally arrest somebody for placing their hands on him. But is that the most prudent thing to do to a feeble 80-year-old man on the side of the road? I'd venture to say not. What I'd also venture to say is that our pride can take us down some paths that we never thought we would go, all because our ego was hurt in the midst of it. So we can see here that pride is a sickness. But the antidote to it is humility. Pride can cause us to disrespect our parents, to disrespect those in authority who are here to help us. It can cause greed. It can cause self-deception and arrogance. But Proverbs 30 tells us to live humbly, to live with an awareness of our position before God, because God is higher. He is up here, and we're down here. There's a quote that says, "What we know is a drop, and what we don't know is an ocean." And it's by Isaac Newton. Pride was the sin that caused Satan to fall from heaven. And it's known as the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins because pride leads to every other sin. Pride is this idea that we don't need God and that the greatest desire that we should have is for our own selfish ambition to fulfill that hedonistic pleasure in all of us. We know through the Bible that it says pride comes before a fall. So what I'll ask you today, church, is be humble or be humbled. Now that we're ending, I'm going to have our chairman of the elders, Michael Royer, come up, and he's going to give the tithe and offerings, and then we're going to pray. Dear Lord, we pray that you would give us wisdom as we seek to honor you, Lord. Help us to find the areas in our life where we struggle with pride. Help us to have the self-awareness to know when we're wrong. Lord, help us to mediate our egos, to not take things personally, Lord, to not use people as instruments or obstacles. Lord, we pray that you would give us wisdom in our interactions. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.